The Sheriff contains graphic descriptions of violence, and in several episodes, sexual assault. It may not be for all listeners. Hi, I'm Tony Adame, and you're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you might get your podcast from.
Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves. Confucius.
The wheels of justice in Okaloosa County have a tendency to turn very slowly.
This is episode 5, Dig 2 Graves.
This case was tried in November of 58.
Yes, sir.
Prior to that time, during the summer of 58, well, let me back up a minute. Let me go all the way back and give you some background here.
Please do. That's the voice of Judge Irwin Fleet. He's 92 years old and lives in Shalimar, just outside of Fort Walton Beach, with his wife, Jo. Judge Fleet was just 30 years old when he was appointed Okaloosa County Circuit Judge in 1957. And in 1958, he presided over one of the more infamous cases in the history of Northwest Florida. That was the first-degree murder trial of brothers Jesse and Doyle Cason and their friend, William Doris Brown, for the 1940 murder of Okaloosa County Sheriff's candidate Lester Wilson. The first time I read through the trial transcript, I have to admit that I didn't know a lot of the backstory of the case. And just from reading the transcript, I thought that Judge Fleet in 1958 was about 50 or 60 years old. And that was just based on how he ran his courtroom. It seemed like a really seasoned, experienced judge and was really decisive about all the rulings he made and just how he ran his courtroom. He was very strict. Our great producer and the digital editor here at the Daily News, Nick Tomachek, approached me several weeks ago and told me that he tracked down Judge Fleet. I was a little hesitant at first because I realized that he must be someone in his 90s, and I wasn't sure if he still remembered much about the case. Well, I couldn't have been much more wrong. Judge Fleet has a great memory of the case. His notes are still in pristine condition, and he was really willing to talk about it with us and go over anything we wanted.
It kind of gets into, let me ask you about one of your rulings before.
You ask me any question you want.
And that's the thing about Judge Fleet that I learned really quickly. If he tells you something, he means it. And when he said I could ask him any question I wanted, my first question was how he came to preside over this trial in the first place.
We had no resident circuit judge in Okaloosa County. So in 57, when we grew up to get the next circuit judge, the other 3 circuit judges before whom I've been trying cases recommended to the governor the appointment of me. So I was Okaloosa County's first resident circuit judge.
Okay.
So that's how it came about that I was presiding over this trial.
Judge Fleet really set the tone for this trial from the beginning, in that he wasn't really going to put up with a lot of nonsense. He wouldn't allow cameras in the courtroom, the courthouse, or on the courthouse lawn. And he really seemed to have an idea of the scope of the trial and the magnitude of it before anyone else did.
And I was known as a strict disciplinarian, and I felt very strongly about nothing distracting from the seriousness of that trial.
Do you remember, is that how you treated every trial, or do you remember that trial being maybe even more amplified because of the situation?
The only thing that you could say was the fact that it got so much public attention. This trial received national attention.
Judge Fleet was right. The trial was national news, mainly because of the backstory of it, with Ray Wilson, who was now the Okaloosa County Sheriff in 1958, having been in the house when his father, Lester Wilson, was murdered in 1940. In the last episode, we went over the state of Florida's case against the Cason brothers and William Doris Brown. They had begun and ended their case with a pair of bombshell witnesses. The first of the bombshell witnesses was a woman named Mattie Lee Beck. Mattie Lee had lived in Crestview starting in January 1940 and become really close to the Cason brothers right away. In fact, becoming sexually involved with both of them. Mattie Lee gave damning testimony about both of the Casons and William Doris Brown. Leading up to the night of March 15, 1940, she'd heard all 3 men discussing Lester Wilson's candidacy for sheriff. Specifically, how he was never going to be sheriff because they were going to do something about it. On the night of March 15, 1940, Maddie claimed that she'd been with all three men at the Sunray Cafe in downtown Crestview, where they'd been discussing the plan to murder Lester Wilson. She'd actually walked out to William Doris Brown's car and sat in the front seat, where she saw two shotguns in the car. She then claimed that after getting out of the car, she'd seen the three men get in, start it up with the lights off, which is key, and turn around and follow a car with Lester Wilson in it out of downtown Crestview and toward Long Drive where Lester Wilson lived. Later, on the night of the murder, Maddie Lee had been driven out of town by William Doris Brown with Doyle Kaysen in the front seat. They dropped Doyle off. Maddie Lee was driven to a remote area where William Doris Brown forced her to have sex with him. On the way back, they stopped, and a man pulled Maddie Lee out of the car. She couldn't identify him. The man beat Maddie Lee with a club of some sort and warned her to forget about what she'd seen that night. She spent the next 5 months in sort of a suspended state of terror, with both Jesse Kaysen and Doyle Kaysen making pretty incriminating statements about their involvement in Lester Wilson's murder in that time. After a final incident with Doyle Kaysen, in which he'd talked about seeing his brother's face after he shot Lester Wilson in the head with a shotgun, she decided it was finally time to leave town. And she left with 15 cents in her pocket. The second bombshell witness for the state, and the one they closed out their case with, was named Marjorie King, formerly Marjorie Sasser. Marjorie testified that she'd been helping Jesse Kaysen's mother, Katie Jean Kaysen, take care of Jesse as he suffered through severe alcohol and morphine withdrawals in 1943. Marjorie said she'd eavesdropped on a conversation in Jesse's room between him, Okaloosa County Sheriff H. Al Enzer, former Okaloosa County Sheriff Johnny P. Steele, and Okaloosa County Constable Joe Adams, in which the three men implored Jesse to check himself into the Florida State Hospital, formerly known as the Florida Hospital for the Mentally Insane. Jesse had been talking openly for months about killing Lester Wilson. Chattahoochee at the time was an awful place. They even made a movie about it in 1989 called, you won't believe this, Chattahoochee.
On Valentine's Day in 1955, in the state of Florida, there was only one cure for insanity. Chattahoochee.
It's not streaming anywhere for free, but you can buy it for $4 on Amazon Prime, like I did if you want to, but I can save you the time and tell you it's not very good. It's based on the story of Korean War veteran Chris Calhoun, whose experience at Chattahoochee while suffering from PTSD led to sweeping state reforms at the hospital. Sheriff Enzer, along with his brothers, Drs. Olin Enzer and Dr. Judd Enzer, ran the powerful Enzer Brothers Hospital in Crestview, and they were part of a political machine who had a very specific way of dealing with things at that time that really lined up with Marjorie King's testimony. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever else you might get your podcast from.
The rumors were, when I came to the county in 1950, Al Enzer was the sheriff.
This is Judge Fleet again.
And the rumors were at that time that the political faction that was in control of politics in the county was comprised of the county judge, Wilbur Osmond, the state senator, Newman Bracken, the sheriff, Al Enzer, and the Enzer brothers who had the hospital. And if somebody got out of line or something, the Enzer brothers would declare them incompetent.
Now that lines a lot up with the story that Marjorie King told and a lot of what we've gone over in this podcast about a powerful political faction in Okaloosa County who was pulling the strings, so to speak, and played a big role in Lester Wilson's murder and the cover-up afterward. The state's case against the Kaysens and Brown was pretty meticulous, and both of the attorneys on the defense side, Thomas Beasley for the Kaysens and Farron Campbell for William Doris Brown, faced an uphill battle. One of the big reasons the state had been able to put together such a great case was because of Ray Wilson and his family. Ray, who had investigated his father's murder alongside Pensacola Police Department investigator Walter Steinsick, had divested himself of any role in the case once the guys were arrested. Now, once that happened, he approached Judge Fleet and William Hallows and asked if he and his family could pay for another attorney for the prosecution. It was kind of an unusual request, but something that wasn't out of pocket, as long as the state wasn't paying for it, and as long as the lawyer was in good standing. And the Wilsons picked a really good attorney, Forsyth Buddy Caro, a longtime lawyer out of Pensacola who had won a lot of famous cases and had a really great reputation in the area. Buddy Caro's addition to the prosecution opened up William Howells and Gillis Powell, another state attorney, to focus almost specifically on the state's case against the three defendants. And they let Buddy Caro handle almost all by himself, taking on the defense. And he was more than up to it. Caro was a Pensacola native and former local baseball star. He'd been practicing for 40 years by the time the Wilson case came around, and he was known for some kind of quirks. The main one was that he always had the stub of a cigar, like a half cigar, either clenched between his teeth or holding it in his fingers, kind of like a nervous tic, although no one ever really saw him light it. So the state's case against the three men boiled down to Jesse being the shooter and Doyle and William Doris Brown being his direct accomplices, as in they helped carry out the planning and execution of the killing. Thomas Beasley presented Doyle Cason's defense first, and it started with his alibi. Doyle said he picked up his friend, One-Eyed Burris Brown, around 4 p.m. They borrowed fishing equipment from another friend, Clarence Alford. Then they went to local fishing holes at Silver Creek and Tie Creek. There, they'd intermittently cooked supper, waded in the creek, fished, built a fire and dried out, fished again. They also claimed they'd run into several people they knew that day at the creek and returned to town just minutes, and I mean like 5 or 10 minutes, after Lester Wilson was shot. Burris Brown couldn't be called to testify because he died several years before the trial began, so the first witness that the defense called was Mrs. Ollie Morrill. She was Burris's widow and basically just confirmed that he was dead. The next witness for the defense was Clarence Alford, who testified that Doyle, quote, may or may not have borrowed fishing equipment from him on March 15th. He did confirm that he and his nephew, Roy Alford, had gone up to Silver Creek and Tie Creek that night to check on a moonshine mill they'd hidden. It was a moonshine mill they used to make whiskey, and Clarence Alford testified that even if he had seen Doyle that day, he hadn't seen him again after 4 p.m. The next person called to testify for the defense was Roy Alford, Clarence's nephew. He said he'd seen Doyle and Burris around 7 p.m. on the road. Then he saw them again around 9 p.m. That was when he said they told him they had a problem with their headlights on Doyle's car. Roy admitted that he had no way to gauge the exact time he'd seen the two men because he never had a watch. Roy was also called to testify before the 1940 and 1952 grand juries, in which he'd given some damning testimony against Jesse. Just like in previous episodes, I've had some of my co-workers read transcripts from the trial, different parts of the trial, so we can get more of a sense of how it was live, and I'll be filling in with the voices for the attorneys. Here's what Roy Alford had to say at his 1958 testimony.
Did you tell us, under oath, Mr. Alford, that Jesse Cason talked to you in the Crestview bar and told you not to give anybody any clues in the Wilson case?
I don't remember how the subject came up, but the best I remember, we were discussing something about someone's death, and I said I would like to know the outcome of Mr. Wilson's death and how he got killed.
Hey, listen, just answer the question, Mr. Alford. Did you say under oath that Jesse Cason told you, don't give them any clues, we've been friends? Did Jesse Cason tell you this?
Yes, sir.
Charlie King was fishing on Silver Creek and Tie Creek on the night of March 15th as well. He was with his wife and his two sons, who waited close by his family's truck while Charlie fished. Charlie said he saw Doyle and Burris together, quote, sometime around dusk in the early part of the night. He said the two were fishing, from what they said, but he didn't see any fishing gear. They talked to Charlie for a few minutes, said that Doyle's headlight was gone out, and Charlie offered them an extra headlight bulb that he had in his truck, but they declined. Farron Campbell, William Doris Brown's attorney, established quickly, as he would with a succession of witnesses, that the man Doyle was seen with at the creek was Burris Brown, and not his client, William Doris Brown, which Charlie King confirmed. On cross-examination, Buddy Caro established that it was about a 10-minute drive from the area on Silver Creek and Tie Creek where Doyle and Burris had been seen to get to the Wilsons' house, and that while King had originally guessed he'd seen the two men around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., that he had no basis for guessing the time. Campbell's first defense witness for William Doris Brown would quickly establish that the timeline being presented by Beasley in Doyle's defense was greatly flawed. That was when he called William Riley, who worked in weather service for the local Air Navigation and Weather Service Board. Riley testified that sundown on March 15, 1940 would have occurred around 6 p.m. So if King thought, like he'd said, that he'd seen Doyle and Burris, quote, around dusk, then there's just no way it could have been around 8 or 9 p.m. Arlie Royals was a local mechanic who lived in Crestview, and on the night of March 15th, he was sitting on his front porch waiting for his children to return home from their school, where they were doing a rehearsal for a school play. When the news broke about the shooting of Lester Wilson, the rehearsal was immediately called off, and the kids came running down the street toward home, a distance of about 6 or 7 blocks. Royals recalls this because they came running up to the front porch where he was just minutes after Royals heard Lester Wilson had been shot. And just minutes after that, less than 15 to 30 minutes he estimated, Royals saw Doyle Cason and Burris Brown pull up to his house. He walked over and they said they were having trouble with their headlights. They were in Doyle's car, and Royals said he did notice fishing equipment in the car, and he began to discuss the shooting with them.
Anyway, I told Doyle Les Wilson was shot and the children didn't know if he was dead. I said, "Do you hear about Mr. Wilson getting shot a while ago?" Doyle said, "What did you say?" I straightened up and stepped to the window and said, "Somebody shot Mr. Wilson." He turned and said, "Burris, did you hear what he said?" We were just discussing it. You know how people will excited over something. I finally found the source of the trouble. I don't reckon they were there over 5 minutes.
Arlie was quick to find the trouble with the headlights and thought it was kind of unusual. It was a wire in a small tube running from the fuse block to the steering column that had been disconnected. To get to this wire, you had to open the hood of the car and reach underneath. Arlie knew the car well because his boss had sold it to Doyle with the understanding that if little things went wrong, Royals would be able to fix stuff on the vehicle here or there. Buddy Caro established on cross-examination that Royals had fixed the light by simply reconnecting the wire, and that Doyle had said the light's connection must have been jarred loose by, quote, driving through thick brush to get to a fishing spot. Caro got Royals to testify that this was almost impossible because of the wire's location, directly beneath the steering wheel and under the hood. So it would have been almost impossible for any sort of brush to get to that part of the car. Arlie was also able to tell the court that he'd experienced what many in Crestview would in the days, weeks, and months following Lester Wilson's murder. A warning that was veiled as a request.
Do you remember testifying for the grand jury before Mr. Howells and I under oath?
Yes, sir.
Did you testify to us under oath that Doyle Cason said, if anyone should ask you about us, say that you had to repair the lights and that we had been fishing?
I don't remember about the fishing, but if anyone should ask me, did I repair the lights to say that, I did.
With Beasley leading the questioning, Doyle took the stand in his own defense. He was 51 years old at the time, meaning he would have been 33 in 1940 when Lester was murdered. Beasley began to establish a timeline with Doyle, an alibi, for March 15th. That started around 4 p.m. when Doyle said he went to pick Burris Brown up from work. At the time, Burris was working for the Work Projects Administration, a New Deal agency focused on public works projects. In Okaloosa County, that meant almost exclusively creating new roads. Here's Doyle's alibi being questioned by Beasley. His alibi starts around 4 p.m. when he goes to pick Burris Brown up from work.
Waited for him to get off. We went to his house and got his gig, another pair of trousers and an old pair of shoes. We came back to Paul's service station and grocery store and got gassed up, bought some eggs and potatoes, and we went to Clarence Alford's on South 85 and got his gig. We talked with him. We went to Tai Creek and cooked supper. We waded up the creek and built up a fire and dried out. We walked back up the creek with our gigs, but I didn't see any fish. We started back and must have run over something that snatched the lights off. I tried to fix them, but I couldn't. I run into Roy Alford in Tai Creek. Then we come up to Silver Creek without any lights and went in and talked to Charlie King and Roy Alford again. I lit a torch, went to the creek where Charlie King was. His wife and young ones were at the bridge in the truck. He told me he had some bulbs, and I told him if it would burn out, I would use them to go to town and would bring them back, and he said to get one. We had to have a screwdriver for that. His truck was a half mile from where we talked to him. I didn't have a screwdriver to get the bulb out. I cranked up and drove on out to the highway near Cox Bridge and Stroud Old Farm. Every time I would see a car coming, I'd pull off the highway and stop. That happened 4 or 5 times before I got to town. I pulled into Arlie Royals and told him I had light trouble. He asked me if I had heard that Les Wilson was killed, and I said no. He said he was shot a while ago. We came on and unloaded our wet clothes and shoes, gigs and frying pan, or mine. We left Burris's wet clothes and gig on my car. I went to Raymond's and Arlene's and told them about it, and that was where we unloaded my stuff. We went to Wilson's. I talked to first one and another. I goes in the house and helps clean the room up. I was in and out of the house, never did leave the premises. I made a couple of pots of coffee, and was out bringing big logs of wood to put on the fireplace until the next morning.
If you just heard that and you're confused, that's totally fine. At this point, Doyle was trying to put together a timeline where he put together his day, but it didn't really make sense. So the next day, Doyle says that he goes and spends the entire day with Burris Brown, his wife, and his sister-in-law in Argyle, where the sister-in-law lived. Thomas Beasley finally tried to establish something of a timeline after that.
Were you on Crestview between sundown and the time you heard Les Wilson was killed?
No, sir. We left Crestview, I imagine, around 5 o'clock. Burris got off around 4:30. We picked his stuff up, went by Paul Sepp's and bought the eggs and potatoes, and turned around and went on 85 South.
Doyle also denied ever meeting William Doris Brown before they were both in jail together in Panama City, and after they'd been arrested for Lester's murder. And with Beasley questioning, Doyle then issued a blanket series of denials to essentially all of Maddie Lee Beck's testimony. In short, he said that he'd never seen Maddie Lee Beck before she'd walked into court to testify. Doyle also denied ever going on a ride to Niceville with William Doris Brown and Maddie Lee the night of the Wilson murder, and being dropped off at some point. He denied being with Maddie Lee later that night, and coming to her house drunk, and forcing her to come down to the railroad tracks with him. He denied being at the Sunray Cafe at all the day of the murder, or making a phone call from the Standard service station to the Sunray Cafe on the night of the murder. He denied making any call from the Standard service station on March 15th. He also said it was quote-unquote impossible for Curtis Davis to have seen his car coming off of Long Drive in the minutes after the shooting because, quote, I was at the creek. The only thing Doyle did admit was to vaguely recalling having the conversation with Venie Davis at the Wilson's house, and only the part where he asked her if she wanted to come outside and see his fishing gear, and not the part where he told her she was better off for not having seen the killers of Lester Wilson as they fled from the scene. On cross-examination by Buddy Carroll, Doyle admitted he'd gotten back to town after fishing around 8:15 or 8:30 p.m. Then he was at the Wilson house by 9 p.m. Doyle said he didn't go to the Sunray Cafe, quote, very often, and then when asked what very often was, he said he was only there 2 or 3 times a week. He also admitted that he knew quite a few women who worked at the same shirt factory as Maddie Lee, but not Maddie Lee, who lived almost directly next door to the Sunray Cafe and was there on a regular basis during the same time Doyle was. One thing Doyle did do at the end of his testimony that several other witnesses did was try to bring the killing of Marie MacArthur into the case. Judge Fleet wasn't having it, though. Every time that Marie MacArthur's name came up throughout the trial, Judge Fleet would shut it down. And he had a pretty good reason for that. Here's Doyle's testimony about Marie MacArthur.
Did you call Enzer Brothers Hospital the morning after Les Wilson was killed?
I have not.
You didn't call out there for Dr. Enzer?
No, sir.
Did you tell Artie Royals if anybody asks about us, say we were out here and got the lights fixed?
I probably told him I'm joking way after he told us Mr. Wilson was murdered.
You probably told him in a joking way after he told you Mr. Wilson was murdered?
Yes, sir. Lots of folks thought me and Les Wilson were on the outs.
Lots of folks thought you and Les Wilson were on the outs.
Right.
In other words, you were not friendly with Les Wilson.
I was.
But he was not friendly with you?
He was, but then when Charlie Powell and this MacArthur...
I was actually able to ask Judge Fleet about why he wouldn't allow anything in the case about Marie MacArthur's killing, which he was very aware of.
I believe 2 or 3 times they tried to bring that up and you shut it down. Was that seemed like it may have had to do with motive, and it got shut down, especially when they would try to bring up what with Lester Wilson having killed someone the year before and the connection between those two things.
There were certain parts of it that was not admissible, Rod.
Why was the killing of Marie MacArthur, why did you think that shouldn't play a role in it? Just
because it wasn't relevant to the particulars in this case.
Okay. And
a complete distraction.
And Judge Fleet's not wrong. Think about it this way. If either the defense or the prosecution wanted to bring in the killing of Marie MacArthur into this case, it was something that needed to be presented not only in the indictment, but in the prosecution's case against these three men. And in order to do that, there would have been, discovery, and they would have had to state that from a very early stage, which they did not. So whatever Judge Fleet saw in the courtroom, he had to rule on. He knows about the killing of Marie MacArthur. He's well aware of the history there. He understands that it may have played into this killing, but he can't be the prosecution and the defense. He's got to be the judge. And I think that's why Judge Fleet was so good at his job and did it for so long. But back to Doyle Case and the end of his defense. Doyle told Buddy Caro the only time he was ever in the Wilson house was on the night of Lester Wilson's murder, and then the morning after. On the redirect, Beasley unsuccessfully tried to establish Doyle was out of town working when he would have made that comment, quote unquote, that sort of thing weighs on you, confession to his friend Martha Helms at the Markham Tavern. And that was in 1944, I believe. The defense also called Dempsey Outlaw to testify for Doyle. Dempsey was working at the Standard service station on the night of March 15th. Beasley got Dempsey to say he closed the Standard at 6:30 p.m., meaning there was no way Doyle could have made the call that Marie Coker testified she heard him make to the Sunray Cafe. That was just before 8 p.m. And that was the call to see who was driving the Wilson taxi that night. Caro established that in 1940, Dempsey Outlaw actually told state investigator Henry Clay Mitchell that he closed the Standard at around 8 p.m. on the night of March 15th, and that there was actually no set closing time, and they just went by, quote-unquote, how business was going. The first testimony logged for William Doris Brown's defense was from Lily Lindsay, an elderly woman who would serve as a large part of Brown's alibi. She couldn't physically testify in court, and her doctor was brought in to testify that she was too ill to leave the hospital. Because of this, Lily Lindsay's testimony was taken from the hospital and allowed into the official court record, and Farron Campbell was allowed to read her testimony to the court. And this gave William Doris Brown's defense a big advantage, mainly because she wasn't there to get cross-examined by Buddy Caro. Lily Lindsay claimed that Brown and his wife, Mertice, came to her home in Crestview on the night of Lester Wilson's murder. They were there to visit Lily's sick husband, their former neighbor of the Browns, that is, and a preacher in town. Lily testified that it was the only time that the Browns had ever come to their home until July 1958, after William Doris Brown's arrest. After that, Lily said, both Mertice Brown, William Doris Brown's wife, and William Doris Brown had come to visit her separately 2 or 3 times each to speak about what the alibi was going to be, and all before the trial started. Lily's daughter, Janie Mae Curry, was also called to the stand and essentially testified to the same thing as her mom did, only adding that she knew they visited the night of the murder because she heard the news about Lester Wilson the next day. William Doris Brown's wife, Mertice, was called to testify as well. She said essentially the same thing that Lily Lindsay and Janie Mae Curry did, that she and her husband went to visit their former neighbors. They'd left their 2 children with William Doris Brown's mother at his brother Carl's house, which was right next door to where they lived. And after leaving Lily Lindsay's house, they came back home to pick up the kids, and that's when they were told about Lester Wilson's murder. Mertice testified that after picking up the kids, Doris didn't come in the house, and it should be pointed out they lived about 5 minutes from where the Wilsons lived on Long Drive. Mertice Brown said Doris left immediately, she said, to go visit another sick preacher, a man named Mr. Arnett, and didn't come home until much, much later. Mertice also testified that she and her husband visited the Lindsays more than once before 1958, but the family says they were there at the house just once, on the day of the murder. So William Doris Brown's alibi, as far as anyone else is concerned with the case, or any credible information they'd gotten so far, ends right around the time, or right before the time, that Mattie Lee Beck says he shoved her in his car outside of the Crestview post office. Campbell then called Carl Brown to the stand. Carl was William Doris Brown's brother and also his next-door neighbor. Carl also was in kind of an interesting position. He lived next door to his brother on one side And on the other side were the Huttos, Alfred and Sharon Hutto. Sharon Hutto was obviously Lester Wilson's younger sister, and Alfred Hutto was his brother-in-law. Carl said he was standing on the front porch of his home with a man named Earl Highnote when they heard the gunshot that killed Lester Wilson. Carl said he was also part of the group with Alfred Hutto that went out to this place called Camp 12 to obtain the Okaloosa County Sheriff's bloodhounds. And the reason for that was they wanted to go get the bloodhounds to try and search for the men who killed Lester. But when they got out to Camp 12, all of the Okaloosa County Sheriff's bloodhounds had gone missing. He also said something that was kind of interesting, that when William Doris Brown and Mertice Brown came back, allegedly, from the Lily Lindsay house where they were visiting the sick preacher, that he sat in William Doris Brown's car for about 10 minutes, is what he said, and talked about the Wilson murder with Doris Brown before Doris took off. And it also was what Carl Brown allegedly said to Earl Highnote on his porch that night that made it into the testimony, thanks to Buddy Caro. This is from Carl's testimony, being questioned by Buddy Caro.
Was Earl Highnote at your house at the time of the murder?
Who?
Earl Highnote.
Yes.
And you say you heard the gun fired?
Yes, sir.
Did you say that is the gun that got the son of a bitch?
No, sir. I didn't say it like that.
What did you say?
I disremember what was said.
How did you know it was at the Wilson house?
I did know it was at the Wilson house.
How did you find out to run over there?
I went out on the back porch, and Mrs. Hutto came out on her porch. She said, "Lord have mercy, that is Bama."
That is who?
Bama, his wife. She said, "Somebody has killed Brother Les."
Those are the words that she said.
She heard the shot fired and said, "Somebody has killed Brother Les."
Okay, that's what you're saying, she said.
Just like Doyle, William Doris Brown testified in his own defense. Doris was 49 years old in 1958, meaning he would have been 31 when Lester Wilson was murdered in 1940. Doris said in 1940 he was working for the Work Projects Agency, the same place that One-Eyed Burris Brown worked when Doyle Kaysen picked him up on the day of the murder. Doris, like Doyle, issued blanket denials to all the state's testimony that incriminated him in any way. He had never seen Mattie Lee. He was never in the Sunray Cafe. And obviously he said he had nothing to do with Lester's murder. He did seem to have a rock-solid alibi for the part of the night when the murder occurred, thanks to the testimony of Lily Lindsay and her daughter, and his wife. But after that, things get a little shaky. And Doris said on the stand repeatedly that his memory of 18 years ago wasn't pristine. He said he left his house after dropping his wife off and talking with his brother. Then he went to visit another sick preacher friend, Preacher Arnett, which couldn't be corroborated. He said after that he stopped to see a friend, Earl Jernigan, then possibly stopped at a service station. On cross-examination, Caro went over the alibi and tried to get Doris to somewhat diverge from the story he told. Campbell objected because he said Caro was being argumentative with the witness, but he was overruled. Brown, in his defense, held fast and wouldn't budge. It was a big win for the defense already, and Campbell doubled down with two more surprise witnesses that were heard without the jury present. The first was Dan Barnhill, a local man who said he was dropped off by Lester Wilson as a taxi fare in a neighboring town, and as he left the filling station he was dropped off at, a man named Horton Wilkerson confronted him and asked who was driving the taxi. Barnhill told him it was Lester Wilson, and Wilkerson said, quote unquote, "He murdered my cousin, and I'm going to not just kill him, but the ground he stands on. I'm going to take a shotgun and blow his head off at the shoulders." Barnhill said this ignited a minor shoving match between Wilkerson and several other men. Howells objected to having the testimony admitted because it was hearsay. Campbell called another witness, C.V. Brown, to say he ran into Horton Wilkerson at the river just weeks after the killing, and Wilkerson said he was having quote-unquote nightmares about killing Lester Wilson. Then Horton committed suicide 2 weeks later. Fleet heard the testimonies, then ruled that it was all third party, and it was hearsay. And because they couldn't call Horton Wilkerson to the stand, because he's dead obviously, he was throwing it all out and the jury would never hear any of it. What Farron Campbell did, which I think a lot of really good defense attorneys do, is he created a lot of confusion with this. The jury isn't hearing this testimony, but what they are seeing is that they're having to leave the courtroom because of things to do with William Doris Brown's defense. And it just creates confusion. And For a defense attorney to be able to create that kind of confusion, especially in a capital murder case, where the jury is going to be very selective and very serious over every vote, is a win. And when it came to Doris Brown's defense, Campbell just seemed like he kept picking up wins the whole way. Jesse Cason's defense was strikingly different from both his brother's defense and from William Doris Brown's defense. Mainly in that Jesse trotted out essentially a who's who in Crestview to testify for him, even if for most of them it was probably the last place on earth they wanted to be. Even at 56 years old, Jesse Cason still had ties to old money in Crestview. And he also had a lot of the old secrets buried within his own head. Stuff that these guys didn't want coming out. And stuff that they'd do just about anything to keep under wraps. Jesse Cason's life in 1958 was a lot different than it was, 20 and 30 years before that. He'd been part of the cream of the crop in Crestview society, married into the Enzer family, a close confidant of both Bob Sykes and William H. Maples, the man who founded the county. Jesse had been kind of one of the movers and shakers in his early 20s and early 30s. But his own problems, alcoholism, morphine addiction, womanizing, had really kind of cut him low. And by 1958, he was already in bad health. He was running a liquor store, but as I've stated before, he was 56 years old, but looked like he was about 70. Much of Jesse's defense was centered around disproving the testimony of Marjorie King, who was Marjorie Sasser in 1940. That was the woman who said she'd overheard Okaloosa County Sheriff H. Al Enzer, Okaloosa County Constable Joe Adams, and former Okaloosa County Sheriff Johnny P. Steele telling Jesse he needed to check himself into the Florida State Hospital for mental patients in Chattahoochee after he'd admitted to several people he'd killed Lester. And the first man to testify in Jesse Cason's defense was Johnny P. Steele. You're listening to The Sheriff, a new podcast series from the Northwest Florida Daily News and the Gannett Company. We're available on Apple Podcasts, that little purple icon on your iPhone, or Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or wherever else you might get your podcast from. Johnny P. Steele was the sheriff in Okaloosa County from 1933 to 1940, defeating Lester Wilson twice to win the spot, but choosing, or having the choice made for him, not to run in 1940, right after Lester was murdered and was the favorite in the Okaloosa County Sheriff's race. It's also been established that Steele did not come to Lester's house to investigate his death until at least 3 hours after the shooting occurred. The only excuse for this given at the time to state investigators in the Pensacola News-Journal was that Steele was, quote-unquote, serving warrants in the north part of the county and couldn't get back in time. Because Crestview is in the north part of the county, this makes little to no sense. Beasley got Steele to deny straight off any of Marjorie King's testimony that she saw him in Jesse's room in 1943, along with Sheriff Al Enzer and Constable Joe Adams. As Steele was testifying, he drew Fleet's wrath. This was the only time that, in the transcript, it seemed like Fleet really got annoyed with one of the attorneys. In this case, Beasley was questioning Steele and essentially framing the answer for him as he questioned him, which is called leading the witness. He did this twice. Buddy Caro objected twice, and it was sustained both times. And Fleet finally warned Beasley, quote, "Don't go too far, Tom." Steele then just repeated what Beasley had just said, getting the blanket denial on record.
I was never in the presence of Joe Adams and Al Enzer in the Cason home in my life.
Steele's testimony was where I thought that Buddy Caro really took a chance to shine in the trial and really went out on a limb. First, he asked Steele if he knew if Jesse Cason was sent to the state hospital, and got Steele to acknowledge that, yeah, he was aware of it. His second question earned a chorus of objections from the defense team. It was, "Where were you on the night of March 15th, 1940 at 8 p.m.? All the objections were sustained by Fleet, and he sent the jury out of the courtroom. Then, he explained that Steele's only purpose on the stand, as it applied to this case, was either to confirm or deny the testimony by Marjorie King that he was in the Cason's house in 1943, and that he had the conversation with Jesse in 1943 about Lester Wilson's murder and checking into the state hospital." Caro, seemingly undeterred by the warning from Judge Fleet, went at Steele again.
Mr. Steele, you were not friendly with Les Wilson, were you?
Sure I was. I had nothing against the man.
You were friendly with him, or you were a good friend of his?
I was a friend of Wilson, yes.
Let me ask you this. Did you have any conversation in the Crestview bar at approximately 11:15 p.m. on the night Mr. Wilson was killed with Jesse Kaysen?
Fleet shut that line of questioning down once again, on objection from the defense, obviously. But Buddy Carroll kept coming at him.
How long have you known the Kaysens?
I think I've known them since 27.
Have you been good friends with Jesse Kaysen?
Yes.
Are you good friends with Doyle Kaysen?
I was a friend to all of them.
Has Jesse Kaysen ever been in your office, Sheriff Steele?
Yes.
Has Doyle Kaysen ever been in your office?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Steele, did you send all the bloodhounds out of Okaloosa County in the night of March 15, 1940?
By this point, Buddy Carroll was getting pretty close to being held in contempt of court. Carroll clarified that he was almost done questioning Johnny P. Steele and just had one more thing he wanted to ask him, or one more thing he wanted to ask him about. If you remember right, a series of people in the Wilson family and others said that they'd never spoken with Steele at all about Lester Wilson's murder. Johnny P. Steele's defense was that he had done something to investigate it. He'd offered a $250 reward for any information leading to the arrest of Lester Wilson's killers. And he'd also shown up 3 hours after Lester Wilson was shot to the house where he'd been turned away by Fox Wilson and Woodrow Wilson.
Have you ever visited Jesse Kaysen in the home of his parents since the death of Les Wilson?
I stopped there 2 or 3 weeks ago. I don't recall just when, but sometime in the last 3 or 4 weeks I stopped at Jesse's father's home.
The last 2 or 3 weeks. Okay. Did I understand you to testify on direct that you had never been in the presence of Doyle Kaysen or Doris Brown when they made any statement concerning this murder?
Never had.
You never talked to them about it?
I couldn't say. I talked with different ones and their names were mentioned.
I'm not asking you about other people.
I think I talked with Doyle concerning it.
And it's this point of testimony where I think that Johnny P. Steele perjured himself. To be really specific, within just seconds of each other, Johnny P. Steele says that he never talked with Doyle Kaysen and William Doris Brown about Lester Wilson's murder. Then, when he gets pressed by Caro, admits that he did talk with Doyle Kaysen about it. So for all the pressing Caro did, and really pushing things to the point of where he almost was in trouble with the court, he got what he needed out of that testimony. Showed that Johnny P. Steele was a liar. Thomas Beasley's work wasn't done trying to discredit Marjorie King when she testified. The next person he called to the stand was Marjorie's ex-husband, Grover Sasser, who Beasley had actually represented in the Sassers' divorce. Grover testified that his wife never told him about the conversation between Enzer, Steele, Adams, and Kaysen in the 1943 incident at the Kaysens' home. Beasley then asked Grover if Marjorie ever took drugs or narcotics, and Grover testified that she took amytal, amobarbital, which was discontinued in the 1980s because of widespread abuse. Amytal is a barbiturate, a tranquilizer, or a sedative. Caro objected to this line of questioning but was overruled. And it's never established how much amytal she took, or if she had a prescription for it, or what the use was for. Only that Grover said it made her quote-unquote sleepy when she took it. Beasley then called one of Jesse's friends to the stand, a man named Alfonso Garrett, who said he was at the house with the Kaysens and slept in the room with Jesse in the days leading up to the ambulance taking him to the state hospital. Carroll bit back pretty quickly, opening his questioning by asking if Garrett had tried to influence any other witness testimony in the case. There's an argument in the courtroom, and Garrett was dismissed from the stand. Beasley also got Jesse Kaysen Sr. to say Marjorie King was never in the house during Jesse's quote-unquote illness. There were some pretty questionable defense witnesses that came to testify in this case, but none more questionable than Byron Hilburn, a friend of Jesse Kaysen's who had worked at Markamp Tavern for 22 years. And just to clarify something I said in a previous episode about Markamp Tavern, about its location, Markamp was on Highway 90 West, while Juke Hill was on Highway 85 South. So I know it might seem like a little thing, but I want to make that distinction because previously I said that Markamp Tavern was on Juke Hill, but it's not. Back to Hilburn. Hilburn and Jesse Kaysen were friends, and when Hilburn got on the stand, he said that on the night of the murder, he was with Lester Wilson and Woodrow Wilson when they dropped Lester off on Long Drive at 8 p.m. Then, he was with Woodrow Wilson when he went to the cab stand, and that the trip home after they dropped Lester Wilson off had been a quote-unquote long, winding one because Woodrow thought someone was following them. Hilburn testified that he then hopped immediately into Jesse Kaysen's taxi, This is all contradicted by both Beasley and Jesse Kaysen at some point. Beasley actually had the nerve to use Hilburn's testimony as saying, hey, look at that. People really can't remember what they did 18 years ago. It doesn't go without saying, but Hilburn's testimony directly contradicted the testimony of at least, by my count, a half dozen witnesses for the state. It seemed like if there was one witness that was going to get in trouble for what they said on the stand during this trial, it probably should have been Hilburn. I mean, even reading the court transcript 60 years later, it's pretty clear that he's lying. Perhaps the most compelling testimonies for the defense were that of Altie MacArthur and Newman Bracken, who essentially took the stand to provide alibis for Jesse Kaysen. And these were two of the more important, influential men in all of Crestview. Altie MacArthur was a former sheriff and the older brother of Murray MacArthur, the man Lester Wilson killed in self-defense in 1939. We went over the MacArthur's history pretty extensively in episode 2, if you want to go back and hear about it. But it had ties to the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office, where Altie was a sheriff for 2 years, and where his father, J. MacArthur, had been a chief sheriff's deputy under Johnny P. Steele and died in the line of duty in 1933. Altie testified that he was in Bracken's drugstore on the night of March 15, 1940, quote-unquote, hanging out with some friends, and saw Jesse parked out front as he walked in, about 30 minutes or so before he found out about the murder of Lester Wilson. This would have been approximately 8 p.m. Altie, in his 1958 testimony, said he couldn't recall any of the friends he was with from that night. This brings us to kind of a disturbing twist in the story. This next part is from my 2019 conversation with Altie's daughter, Penny Janowski MacArthur, who has a really vivid memory of something involving the night of the murder, or what she was told about something from the night of the murder.
I will tell you this, because it was my father's brother.
Mm-hmm.
My father did say to me one time, don't ever, if anybody ever says anything to you about, did your dad do it, tell him I was sitting in the city pharmacy with a bunch of friends in downtown Crestview when this happened.
Wilson murder.
That's what he's talking about. My husband's saying the Wilson murder. That's what you're talking about, correct, Les Wilson?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, well, your uncle's murder first, actually, but...
Okay, yeah, but the second part about what my dad said to me.
He said if anybody ever asks you, say my dad was sitting in the city pharmacy with friends.
With friends, yeah. So he was never even questioned about it because of that.
It's irresponsible of me or anyone else to assume that Altie MacArthur had anything to do with the murder of Lester Wilson. But it's also irresponsible for the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office to have never even questioned the man in the murder, like his daughter said. If we're looking for motive or motivation, having your little brother killed by someone ranks pretty high up there. But to realize that he was never even questioned in the case and kind of got a pass for the whole thing is pretty unbelievable. And I think after Penny told me what she was told to tell people about where her father was on the night of the murder, she also followed it up with something I've experienced quite a few times when I talk to people on one side of this, or their families. And say that when I talk to anyone that was affiliated with the Wilsons, while we don't always agree, the gist or the bend is always, well, maybe we can get to a better understanding of what happened. Or maybe get to another, really find out what the truth is. But when I talk to people on the other side of it, anyone from the MacArthurs, or anyone to do with the Kaysons, or anyone to do with Doris Brown, there's always a little bit of a, kind of like what the people experienced in 1940, kind of a veiled threat, or just a warning.
Well, I don't want anything said disparaging about my dad because he's innocent in the whole thing. It was a very sad thing, and I would like you to be very careful what you say about that.
Newman Bracken would go on to become a state senator and has a park named after him in Fort Walton Beach, out on Okaloosa Island, and a street named after him in Crestview. He testified that on March 15th he closed his drugstore around 8 p.m., when Altie MacArthur would have still presumably been there, then returned at approximately 8:20 p.m. to, quote-unquote, get medicine. Bracken was met inside of the store by Jesse Kaysen, who told him that he needed medicine for Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. In his 1958 testimony, Bracken said that he'd given Jesse Kaysen, quote-unquote, compounded medicine for Mrs. Wilson. On cross-examination by Caro, Bracken was forced to go over his testimony to the 1940 grand jury, the one that resulted in 0 arrests. Carroll actually had Bracken read from his testimony in 1940, in which he tells state investigator Henry Clay Mitchell that Jesse was, quote-unquote, nervous, excited, and excitable when they met inside the drugstore, and that Jesse had initially demanded that Bracken give him morphine several times before Bracken refused. It's not specified what the drug Bracken did give Jesse was. Bracken also gave no mention of seeing Altie MacArthur in his drugstore in his grand jury testimony in 1940 or his trial testimony in 1958. Jesse Cason was the third of the defendants to testify in his own defense. It's not something you really see in today's courts as far as murder trials, but it happened here, and it happened 3 for 3. So Jesse would have been 38 years old in 1940, and Beasley opened the questioning with Jesse by giving a blanket denial to every testimony from the state's witnesses that incriminated him in the murder. Jesse's alibi was that on March 15th, his only recollection was being parked in front of the Bracken drugstore shortly after 8 p.m. That was when he heard that Lester Wilson had been shot. At that same time, Jesse said, he was scheduled to pick up a Dr. Hart, who he said instructed Jesse to, quote-unquote, rush out there to the Wilsons, where they went, saw that Lester Wilson was shot, dead and dying on the floor, and Dr. Hart then told Jesse to go back to the Bracken drugstore to get a drug for Bama Wilson, the sedative that she said she was offered by Dr. Hart. Then, Jesse took Dr. Hart home. He had no other recollections of March 15, 1940, and definitely did not mention riding around with Byron Hilburn. Jesse, of course, denied ever having seen Maddie Lee Beck before she came to testify in court, even though he did admit that he'd been inside of that house behind the Sunray Cafe on several occasions to pick up other girls to go to Mark Amp or Old Quaker, another bar. As it's been noted, Jesse Cason was married this whole time. Jesse also, of course, denied the testimony by Marjorie King about the meeting in 1943, the alleged meeting between himself, Sheriff Enzer, former Sheriff Steele, and Constable Adams. He did, however, acknowledge that he'd been admitted to the Florida State Hospital in 1943 in Chattahoochee. Jesse thought that he'd been in the Florida State Hospital for about a month, and he said, "They told me I wasn't crazy, that I had just been too full of whiskey." At the time he was admitted to the hospital, Jesse said he was tending bar nights at the Old Quaker bar. Jesse said the first time he ever met William Doris Brown, just like his brother, was when they left the jail in Panama City in July 1958 after their arrests. Jesse said he voted for H. Al Enzer and not Lester Wilson in the 1940 sheriff's election because Enzer was, quote-unquote, a very good friend, and he was very good friends with all the Enzers. But it should be pointed out that Enzer and Lester Wilson never actually ran against each other. Lester was murdered a couple months before the primary. Buddy Caro, of course, was chomping at the bit to get at Jesse Cason on the stand, and he began to rip him to shreds. First, about the Dr. Hart that Jesse said he picked up on the night of March 15th. He actually got Jesse to admit on the record that Dr. Hart, the guy he was picking up that night, wasn't actually a doctor at all. Instead, he was a fake doctor who was practicing medicine and handing out prescriptions at the Enzer Brothers Hospital, and he was eventually sent to the penitentiary for being a fake doctor. And what finally got Cason off the stand? Buddy Caro asked Jesse a series of questions about bootlegging and Lester Wilson's role in getting it shut down, rapid fire style, and just like before, it got shouted down with objections, all sustained by Fleet. And that was it. With that, the defense rested its case. The trial would close out with rebuttal witnesses from the defense and closing arguments from both sides. In courtrooms, special rules apply to rebuttal witnesses, in that rebuttal evidence or the witnesses need to be confined solely to the subject matter of the evidence that's being rebutted. So that means that new evidence on other subjects may not be brought in. However, rebuttal is one of the few vehicles whereby a party may introduce surprise evidence or witnesses. So the basic process goes like this. Both sides are obliged to declare in advance of the trial what witnesses they plan to call and what each witness is expected to testify to. When either a plaintiff or a prosecutor or defendant brings direct evidence or testimony which was not anticipated, the other side may be granted a specific opportunity to rebut it. So in rebuttal, the rebutting party may generally bring witnesses and evidence which were never before declared, as long as they rebut prior evidence. In this case, the prosecution called 13 rebuttal witnesses, meaning there were 13 points of testimony on the defense that they felt like they had a witness that they could directly disprove that testimony. Neither of the defense attorneys called any rebuttal witnesses. The first rebuttal witness called was former state investigator H. Clay Mitchell. Mitchell testified that in 1940, Doyle Outlaw told him in grand jury testimony that he didn't close the standard service station until 8 p.m. This directly contradicted Outlaw's 1952 grand jury testimony and his 1958 trial testimony that he closed the shop at 6:30. Lester Wilson's brother, Fox Wilson, testified on rebuttal that in 1949 or 1950, Grover Sasser told Fox that if he wanted to know more about the murder of his brother, he should talk to his then-wife, Marjorie King. 3 women, Lucille Alford, Dovey Green, and C.T. Scarborough, all testified to knowing Mattie Lee Beck in 1940 when she lived in Crestview. Alford said that on days when it rained, she remembered seeing Jesse Kaysen drop Mattie Lee off at work. Green said she and Doyle Kaysen had, quote-unquote, many conversations about Mattie Lee, who she said Doyle called, quote-unquote, my girl, and that Green saw Mattie Lee, Doyle, and Jesse together on many occasions. Scarborough, whose last name was Strickland in 1940, said she lived on the other end of the house from Mattie Lee and Lucille Wilkinson in 1940, and that she saw Doyle at the house with Mattie Lee at least 10 times, and then on a few occasions, she'd herself gone out with Mattie Lee and both of the Kaysen brothers. Cleveland Sellers was 17 years old and living in an apartment in downtown Crestview on March 15, 1940. He'd been there about 1 month with his new wife. Cleveland testified that he knew Jesse, Doyle, and Mattie Lee, that he'd seen Doyle and Mattie Lee together on several occasions, and he knew them all through his business, which was selling half pints of bootleg whiskey out of his apartment. He also testified that he made deliveries to the Sunray on regular occasions for the Kaysens. On the night of Lester Wilson's murder, Cleveland said he was staying home with the mumps, and that about 9 p.m. Jesse Kaysen came over and bought a half pint of whiskey. Barry Jackson, known as Buster Jackson, had been in a tuberculosis ward in a Tampa clinic for 3 years when he received the summons to testify in the trial. His doctor had told him his disease would ultimately be fatal, and it might be sped up if he traveled to Crestview for the trial, but Jackson came anyway. He testified that he knew Doyle, Jesse, Mattie Lee, and Doris Brown, and he saw Brown with the Kaysens on several occasions. That the night Doyle got beat up outside of the Marcamp Tavern, he'd been the one dancing with Mattie Lee when the fight occurred, which he'd already testified to. And then he watched Mattie Lee leave the bar in Jesse's car with Doyle, Jesse, and Doris Brown. Beasley tried to come back at Jackson, asking him if he'd ever been convicted of a crime. It turned out that Jackson had been convicted of a crime, stealing an automobile, and had it expunged from his record about a decade before. He also went at him asking if, or I would say presenting a question as an answer, that had been the only time that Jackson had seen those 3 people together at Marcamp. Jackson came back with something that was pretty shocking. He said he'd seen Doyle Kaysen at Marcamp many times, mostly with Charlie Powell, William Doris Brown, and One-Eyed Burris Brown. And Charlie Powell was one of the men Lester Wilson shot in 1939 outside of the Spur Cafe in Crestview, the same incident in which he killed Murray MacArthur. The final rebuttal witness was Howard Grantham, who was 25 years old and running the Sunray Cafe in Crestview in 1940. Howard testified that he knew Jesse, Doyle, William Doris Brown, and Mattie Lee, and was working the night of March 15, 1940. He said he remembered the night well because it was Lester's murder. He remembered Jesse was wearing a cowboy hat and people were making fun of him. He remembers a phone call asking who was driving the Wilson taxi because he was the one who answered the phone at the Sunray. He testified that he saw Mattie Lee with Jesse and Doyle separately many times, and they were always at the Sunray and they were always drinking together. And with that, the final witness had been called for both the prosecution and for the defense. Buddy Caro began the closing arguments for both sides. He was tasked with explaining to the jury what the outcomes of the case could be. They could only consider first-degree premeditated murder for all 3 defendants. The standard of guilt for first-degree premeditated murder was that the law didn't differentiate between someone who pulled the trigger and between someone who knowingly helped someone commit the murder. And from that point, if the jury did determine guilt, the only thing to differentiate from that point on was between a sentence of death or life in prison. Caro explained how a person can be convicted on circumstantial evidence. He explained reasonable doubt and also why you don't need to have an eyewitness to a shooting to convict someone. Essentially that if you needed an eyewitness to prove guilt in every shooting out there ever, there'd be a lot of people getting away with killing people by shooting them. Carroll also started to go in on the shadow that had kind of hung over the trial, the political factions that divided the town in 1940, and that had played a large part, it seemed like, in Lester Wilson's murder. Carroll also reminded people in the jury that Crestview was much different in 1940 than it was in 1958. That there were less than 100 telephones in the whole town and less than 100 automobiles. And the population of the town was only about 3,000 people, and many of the people were poor. And by 1958, Crestview's population had grown to almost 10,000 people. I'll read you what I thought was the most compelling part of Buddy Carroll's closing argument. Use your common sense and knowledge of men and affairs as to the size of this community in 1940. Les Wilson was a candidate for sheriff, and it's an important office. It is an office in which criminals are vitally interested. It is an office that controls lawlessness and rackets. It is an office that controls bootlegging, narcotics, dope, abortions, gambling houses. It is an office that, if it is turned over to lawlessness, men can very fast grow wealthy and rich. Mr. Les Wilson had been a candidate, first in 32 and then again in 36, when he ran second. I think there is an inference in this case that somebody didn't want Les Wilson to be sheriff. I think he was killed, and the evidence in the case will show that this was a gangland killing because he was a candidate for sheriff of Okaloosa County. And while he was listening to a radio program, a cowardly assassin blew his brains out. It's not a crime you would commit without certainty your target was going to be home in this case. Who goes down a dead-end road with shotguns to commit a murder if they don't know the person is actually there? And that took planning. And Carroll addresses why more people didn't come forward sooner, the fear of retribution. He made a point that, in most cases, the governor of Florida doesn't send in investigators to a county in a murder case. And that means that the governor of the state of Florida knew that this case was going to be a problem from the start, and that he wanted to take the investigation out of the hands of the Okaloosa County Sheriff's Office from the very start. So, Carroll proposed, if the governor knew that, then the people in Crestview knew that. And the people in Crestview were scared to testify. It's just like Curtis Davis said. My mother and father told me to keep quiet about this. They were afraid for his safety, and other people were afraid for their safety if they spoke up. Carroll also addressed how the defense counsel had accused almost every single state witness of falsifying testimony. He pointed out that everyone who testified for the state still had something to lose, and they'd risk quite a bit to come to testify. He also pointed out how many of their stories match up independent of each other. He makes a good point. People came to testify from Tampa, San Antonio, Mobile, New Orleans, and Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Unknown to each other that they would testify, and they all had stories that lined up. He also went back over the testimony of Curtis Davis and Marjorie King. Curtis said he was the one that saw Joe Adams' car, the constable, and Doyle Cason's car coming off Long Drive immediately after the shooting. Marjorie obviously was the one who saw Adams, Sheriff Enzer, and former Sheriff Steele talking to Jesse Cason about Lester Wilson's murder and about going to the state hospital because he couldn't keep his mouth shut about it. Farron Campbell's closing argument matched Carroll's energy. He really did a great job. He picked apart the state's case. And they say the Casons went over to the Wilsons' house after the murder because of guilt. Campbell then flips it and says that the state also says that William Doris Brown stayed away from the Wilsons' house because of guilt, and that you can't have both things. Well, you can, because they're all different people, but it was still pretty effective. The other thing Campbell came back to in his closing argument was that Burris Brown and William Doris Brown in the same area at the same time created a lot of confusion. And he makes a really good case that people may have been confused between the two solely because of their last name. Campbell finished his closing argument by telling the jury that if they were to acquit William Doris Brown, these were the people that they needed to believe. His wife, his brother, Mrs. Lindsay, who said that William Doris Brown and his wife were at her house, her daughter, who said the same thing, and if you believe them, then you should acquit William Doris Brown. It was very effective. Beasley opened his closing by ripping Mattie Lee Beck's testimony, and then he went to bat for the sheriffs. All the sheriffs that had come before Ray Wilson. He said H. Al Enzer was one of the best guys he ever knew, a man who was taken out of office for corruption. And he really rode hard for Okaloosa County, saying Steele was also a great sheriff. He then ripped Marjorie King for her testimony, calling her a dope fiend. And then Beasley said that he put Byron Hilbert on the stand, the guy who spun a pretty wild tale, just to show how hard it was to remember how bad things were 18 years ago, and how hard it was to remember things from 18 years ago. So that begs the question, and he put this guy on the stand so he would lie? And it didn't really make any sense. I can be honest and say it's one of the worst closing arguments I've ever heard in a case. In real life, on TV, in a movie, ever. It was that bad. Finally, it was William A. Hallows III's turn to close for the state. Hallows opened by picking up a stool and bringing it over to where the jury was sitting. He put it down and sat down before them, and delivered what's thought of as one of the greatest closing arguments in the history of trials in Northwest Florida. It was so good that when Nick and I went to meet with Judge Irwin Fleet in 2020, he still had a copy of it.
The lawyer that prosecuted this case, that was assigned by the governor,
William Hallows
III, he was beautiful. When he went to make his closing argument, the courtroom was packed. And you could have heard a pin drop through the whole closing argument. And I've got that closing argument here.
I actually found the beginning of Hallows' closing argument kind of blustery. He quoted a lot of scripture and really wanted to put the fear of God in the jury, so to speak. But when he got to the meat of the closing argument that he was presenting, it actually was pretty stunning. And here it is.
As I sat in this courtroom last week and I listened to Mrs. Bama Wilson's testimony, I thought to myself, how is it that the swift vengeance of heaven can slumber long enough to permit such a dastardly and awful deed to occur? I have always been told that delays in criminal prosecution help the accused and put the state at a disadvantage. So why the delay? Enough arguments have already been presented to you that I'm sure you know the delay. And I heard just enough from the witness stand in this case that I know the delay. You mean to tell me that a prominent citizen in Okaloosa County is shot down and it takes hours for the sheriff to come to the scene of the homicide? And did he attempt to explain or defend the fact that he did nothing because a member of the family told him not to come in the house? That this somehow justified his position? How did Sheriff Steele know that one of the Wilsons didn't kill their father? Now you mean you can have a killing in this county and the sheriff is 2 hours late getting there and someone can say, Sheriff, don't come in. And he turns around and he leaves. And then, when Mrs. Wilson says to this day she's never been interrogated or questioned by the sheriff of this county at the time of her husband's death or any time since, knowing that, is it any wonder that this case is 18 years being brought to trial?
And that closed out the case for both the state and for the defense. The jury went in for deliberations at 6:45 p.m. and came out at 12:40 a.m. without a verdict. Judge Fleet ordered them back at 10 a.m. the next day to continue deliberations. The court reconvened at 10:14 a.m. on Sunday, November 23rd, 1958. The jury was in deliberations until 3:09 p.m. and they came back with verdicts.
We, the jury, find the defendant William Doris Brown not guilty. So say we all. We, the jury, find the defendants Jesse Kaysen and Doyle Kaysen guilty of murder in the first degree, as charged in the indictment. So say we all, and the majority of us recommend them to the mercy of the court.
On the season finale of The Sheriff.
Let me ask you about him. What do you remember about Ray Wilson at that time?
Ray was a fine sheriff.
Mm-hmm.
He was a good sheriff. He was an honest man, and he ran a good department.
Good.
And I could rely on him when I needed it, except for one time.
They believe he was killed by somebody brought in from out of town because he was going to shake up the status quo at the time, you know. And Plus, you figure, I mean, those guys only served 8 years before they were paroled. I just don't think that anybody really were convinced that they had done it.
The Sheriff is recorded at the Northwest Florida Daily News in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. It's written and researched by me, Tony Adame, and it's edited and produced by Nick Tomachek. Additional voice work in this episode was provided by Dusty Ricketts, Sam Grubenoff, Nick Tomachek, Seth Stringer, Savannah Evanoff, and Tony Judnich. Original music by Nick Tomachek.
You having fun, Nick?